have Stuart Gottlieb, who teaches at SIPA and is a member of the Saltzman Institute and faculty director for SIPA's certificate degree program in international relations. And in his previous life, worked for 5 years in the U.S. Senate for Senators Schumer and Dodd, as well as working on several political campaigns. And he was educated at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a PhD from Columbia. Robert Jervis, most of you know, is Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Politics, winner of many awards, author of many books, including Why Intelligence Fails, System Effects, The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, and most recently, American Foreign Policy in a New Era. He was president of the American Political Science Association, and he chaired the Historical Review Panel for the Central Intelligence Agency until today.
Yes.
Congratulations.
He wasn't fired. I'm told the whole panel was fired. I told him he should be honored to be a casualty of the Trump revolution. Rebecca Friedman Lissner will be Assistant Professor of Security Studies in the Center of Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College beginning in 2019. And she is a serial fellow, postdoctoral research fellow at Penn, Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Brady Johnson predoctoral fellow at Yale, Smith Richardson Foundation World Politics and Statecraft fellow, and previously has worked as special advisor to the Deputy Secretary of Energy and is a research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations and consultant to the Departments of State and Defense. She's working on a book that examines how military interventions shape great powers' grand strategies. And she was educated at Harvard and PhD from Georgetown. Jack Snyder, Reverend Belfer Professor of International Relations. His numerous books include The Ideology of the Offensive, Power and Progress, Myths of Empire, and with Ed Mansfield, Electing to Fight. He was educated at Harvard and is also a Columbia PhD. And Stephen Wertheim, historian of U.S. foreign relations and international order, specializing in concepts of politics and law from the 19th century to the present. His work has explored the rise of American global power, the origins of international organization, ideas of international public opinion and grand strategy, and ethics of humanitarian intervention. He's currently writing a book tentatively entitled Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy in World War II. He's the author of numerous academic articles. He was previously a permanent lecturer in history at Birkbeck, University of London, junior research fellow at King's College, University of Cambridge, and a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton. He was an undergraduate at Harvard and a PhD from Columbia. And he will also kick off the panel with his irreverent view of the vaunted liberal order.
All right, well, thank you very much, Professor Betts. I'm delighted to have this conversation about whether the liberal world order is worth defending. I am going to answer this afternoon, no, the liberal world order is not worth defending, first of all, because it doesn't exist, at least not in anything like the form that many experts have been claiming. And second, even if the liberal world order did exist, it would still be a mistake, I'll argue, to defend it as such. So let me take those two arguments in turn before everyone says why I'm wrong. First, I think there is no such thing as the post-war US-led liberal world order, and I think this not because I'm an arch international relations realist who believes norms, laws, institutions don't matter. Quite the contrary, I think these things matter immensely, so much so that they could not all be folded into a single order or attributed to US leadership. The phrase liberal world order or liberal international order has come into widespread usage only recently. Throughout the 20th century, politicians and commentators in the United States spoke often of world order and international order, but rarely of liberal world order. That phrase has exploded in popular usage in our time, first as a trickle in the past few decades, and now as a deluge in response to Donald Trump. The liberal world order has been invoked to interpret and criticize Trump in association with right-wing populist movements. Like all concepts that attain currency in op-ed pages, the term now goes rarely defined. It appears in the guise of common sense. But it clearly is being used to distinguish Trump from his predecessors in the presidency since 1945, who are all supposed to have basically upheld this order, whereas Trump wants to tear it down. The liberal world order can also be understood as an iteration of the attack on Trump as an isolationist during the campaign and in his early months in office, the claim in both cases being that Trump seeks to withdraw the United States from world leadership. We no longer hear that Trump is an isolationist, but the charge that he's bringing down the liberal world order remains perhaps the most prominent foreign policy criticism of him today. But I struggle to reconcile this large charge with his actions to date. So far, Trump has left intact every alliance he inherited and strengthened several, though the Saudis are doing their best to undermine theirs. The United States has formal security commitments with around 70 countries, and I don't believe Trump has undone a single one of these. Now, he has pulled out of multilateral agreements, and now the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty at the urging of Reagan administration alum John Bolton. He has imposed tariffs following the playbook of Reagan trade official Rob Lighthizer. But we have terms for these measures: unilateralism, protectionism, and they come from familiar places in American foreign policy circles. So we need to analyze that, which requires connecting Trump and his administration with their predecessors, not setting him wholly apart. Furthermore, the liberal world order seems to me too capacious to be meaningful as a concept. It, I think, has never existed as such. Before 2016, we had no problem discussing rules, laws, alliances, and so forth. But now these various arrangements are being reified into a single structure, the order, as though this order contains core principles that can solve problems in our time. But international politics after 1945 radically varied in time and space. For example, US security commitments span the gamut from intimate institutions in Western Europe to bilateral arrangements in East Asia and to sporadic, more nakedly coercive interventions in the global South. We should debate each of these entities like NATO, but invoking the liberal order doesn't seem to help because that order, if it existed, contained the NATO model and countermodels. In order to explain the order's relevance today, its defenders have repeatedly claimed that the order includes the WTO, the EU, and NAFTA. These are indeed actual institutions under challenge today, and they were creations of the 1990s. They differ drastically from their post-World War II counterparts like the GATT or the European Coal and Steel Community. In short, to hold up the post-war liberal world order mystifies more than clarifies, as I see it. Now, could one redefine this term to give it more utility? Of course, and especially for scholarly purposes. But when it comes to intervening in political debate, I worry that scholars tend to overestimate the extent to which they can pluck a concept out of the thick webs of common meaning in order to bend it to their particular purposes. So when I take the liberal world order for what experts and commentators have made of it, I'm compelled to include it doesn't exist. So if you found yourself wholly unconvinced so far, you are in luck, because I want to turn to my second argument. Even if the liberal world order were coherent enough to be defended, we'd still be better off not rallying to its defense. The first reason is that paeans to the post-war order are backward-looking and nostalgic. The last election delivered a stunning rebuke to the people who have made US foreign policy and steered the public debate. American foreign policy faces a legitimacy crisis today, and it perhaps should be no surprise after decades of endless and fruitless wars and attacks on the United States. I doubt, personally, that Donald Trump would have passed the commander-in-chief test with enough of the electorate if he hadn't managed to compensate for his ignorance by showing that he at least recognized that American foreign policy had been failing, when few experts said the same. What have his critics learned since then? They have banded together in an open defense of the status quo anti-Trump, the liberal world order. Instead of recognizing past failure and offering something new, they argue for preserving the old order, maybe amending and extending it. The tragic result of such nostalgia is to cede the initiative to Trump. There's a second problem with the liberal world order as a political message. The liberal world order is a massive abstraction that stifles rather than sharpens debate. Talk of the order diverts our gaze away from concrete choices which have tangible costs and benefits. That is the ground that Trump prowls. It is also the ground where foreign policy debates typically take place, including during the heyday of the supposed order. To cede this ground to Trump reinforces his message, making his critics sound like the globalists whom Trump caricatured in the campaign and continues to position himself against. The liberal world order submerges America's interests into the world's, allowing Trump to stand out by recognizing conflicts between the two. If any of the panelists or members of the audience think that the slogan of the liberal world order would be more attractive to voters than America First, I would be genuinely curious to know why. Nor, I should say, do defenders of the liberal world order seem to advance a robust international solidarity to counter Trump's xenophobia. Calling for a return to the US-led order summons Americans to cooperate with a faceless, agentless order, and on the condition that the United States be its leader and set its rules. Now, I admit it is a genuine challenge in 2018 to identify international forces with which the United States should have deep solidarity, but the liberal world order does not offer a solution to that problem. Could it be, then, that despite claiming a 7-decade pedigree, the concept of the liberal world order is surprisingly vulnerable to attack from each side? It offers a nationalism that dares not speak its name, and an internationalism afraid to walk the talk. So let me conclude by conceding a point. Discussion of the liberal world order gets one thing right. It conveys that the stakes of this moment are high, that the Trump presidency marks a significant rupture of some kind. To me, however, the rupture is likely to be less that Trump tore everything down or tried to, than that politics is returning to American foreign policy. After decades of calm, basic questions are reopening. And so be it. Citizens in a democracy should be welcomed into a debate about their nation's world role. Yet I can't help but read elegies to the post-war order as a form of wishing politics away. The post-war order, to the extent it existed then, won't save us now. And longing for it only elevates the forces of movement, those who, for better or worse, identify new challenges and propose creative ways to meet them. Thank you very much.
And thank you for adhering to the length limits, which I will ruthlessly enforce in order to leave time for audience discussion. Rebecca?
Great. Well, thank you to everyone for being here today, and thanks to the Saltzman Institute for hosting this very important conversation. So our question here today is the liberal international order worth defending? And to answer that question, we must, of course, first define what we mean by the liberal international order. And exactly as Stephen said, despite its centrality to the contemporary foreign policy conversation, the liberal international order is an often rhapsodized but rarely scrutinized concept. So you'll actually find that I agree with much of Stephen's critique as he just laid out, but we will part ways where he dismisses liberal international order wholesale as a useful concept. Now, international order generally refers to the body of rules, norms, and institutions that govern relations among the key players in the international environment. As such, international orders can take many different forms. They might be highly institutionalized in formal regimes and institutions, or they can be much more informal, emerging organically or on the basis of top-down hegemonic coercion. So with that in mind, we see that the liberal international order is only one form of order. It is predicated on open markets and the pacifying role of free trade, collective defense and legal constraints on the use of force, democratic community, and positive sum international cooperation facilitated by multilateral institutions. And while many of these principles far predated 1945, they gave rise to a new set of international organizations in the wake of World War II. Namely, of course, the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, which later became the WTO. However, it is of course true that the liberal international order was never fully liberal, truly international, nor wholly orderly. It certainly did not emerge from World War II as a single crystalline structure with ubiquitous reach. Rather, it evolved over time. It was initially created as a largely Western project designed for post-war rehabilitation and flourished during the Cold War. It diffused into Asia, Africa, and Latin America following decolonization, cracked and listed in the 1970s amidst economic stagnation, and claimed universalism only with the Soviet Union's demise in the 1990s. And to obscure this disjointed 70-plus year evolution by appealing to some monolithic ideal of the liberal international order, as some of its most ardent defenders often do, certainly does little justice to the order's complex history. It is also surely true that the phrase liberal international order has always been shorthand for U.S. global leadership, a structure sustained by American power in service of largely Western preferences. As the most powerful state in the international system, the United States has disproportionately shaped its rules while reserving the right to periodically flout them. But acknowledging that relationship does not imply that the international liberal order is purely a reflection of raw power, as some arch-realists might argue. Even as the US-Soviet Cold War rivalry emerged from a bipolar global system, the United States' embrace of a grand strategy of liberal internationalism guided its approach to international institutions and structured cooperation within the Western Bloc. Unrivaled in the unipolar moment in the 1990s, the United States strategy has been more remarkable for its restraint than its unfettered exercise of coercive power, despite a slew of regrettable excesses. Indeed, the concept of the liberal international order is relevant, even for realists, precisely because it is not reducible to unilateral US interests or to the global distribution of military and economic might. Rather, it emerged and endured through many states' collective efforts. Where rules are institutionalized in organizations or legal regimes, they reflect painstaking efforts by diplomats and lawyers to identify convergent interests and codify standards of behavior. While rules have developed organically in norms or in customary law, they reflect decades of strategic interaction between states, during which repeated patterns of conflict and cooperation have generated predictability. Indeed, by design, the US-led liberal system incorporated such attributes. And as a result, it has offered both stability and considerable political, economic, and security gains to states beyond the United States. But despite all of these successes, the liberal international order, like all international orders, is of course transitory. Every prior international order has ultimately reached its demise. And indeed, history shows that international orders have most commonly broken down through major war, as states seek to create new rules based on new power configurations. And this history makes the stakes of our discussion here today brilliantly clear. Today's foreign policy thinkers face the challenge of renovating the international order to reflect contemporary realities peacefully and without the crucible, or in this context, you might even say, creative destruction of violent conflict. That task, I believe, begins with a strategic reckoning. We must identify what are the long-term trends that challenge the liberal international order from within and without. And you'll note as I discuss these trends in a moment that I do not list Donald Trump among them. I agree with Stephen that the weaponization of the liberal international order as an anti-Trump bludgeon is neither intellectually productive nor politically useful. The fact is that Trump is more an avatar than an architect of the apparent challenge to the liberal international order. His administration's policies may well hasten its destruction, but with or without Trump, the 70-plus-year order would be in desperate need of renovation. So, to return to the question at hand, I want to argue that defending the post-World War II liberal international order is an inadequate and indeed misguided basis for future American grand strategy. Instead, both policymakers and strategists would do well to develop a new 21st century vision for international order that accounts for three major trends. First, and most importantly, we have the challenge of China and Russia as revisionist great power competitors. Since the height of American power in the 1990s, structural shifts have diminished the United States military and economic preponderance. China, as we all know, has grown at a meteoric pace. And China's rise reflects broader eastward shifts in economic dynamism that have diminished the relative powers of our allies and partners, especially in Europe. Allies and partners. Meanwhile, Russia is clearly a power in decline, but even so, Russia retains formidable military and economic capabilities and clearly intends to use that power towards revanchist ends that challenge the US-led order. And we are already starting to see manifestations of these power shifts. Russia and China have both undertaken military modernizations that challenge our local military primacy in areas of Eastern Europe and East Asia proximate to our treaty allies. And this state of affairs challenges the liberal international order, which is and always has been sustained by American power. As US hegemony erodes, so too will the willingness of our near-peer competitors to tolerate an order wherein the distribution of benefits do not reflect the distribution of power. Russia and China have both begun to chip away at the US-led order in their respective regions, with Russia's annexation of Crimea and China's South China Sea island building as just two examples. So that's the first trend. The second trend that challenges the liberal international order is technological change. Legacy institutions and norms are not well equipped to confront the rapidly evolving technological landscape. Advances in fields like biotechnology and artificial intelligence are outpacing domestic regulations, not to mention international regimes. Adapting the order to address new technologies will be particularly vexing, as it will require engaging non-governmental actors with diverse priorities and preferences in addition to sovereign states. Moreover, these technological advances create new avenues for great power competition by creating undergoverned or ungoverned spaces where the boundaries of acceptable state behavior are ill-defined and the threshold for sovereignty violations are lowered, like, for example, in the cyber domain. Second trend. Now, the third trend. The liberal international order is also being undermined, as Stephen pointed out, by eroding support within the United States. Real challenges to the United States' domestic socioeconomic compact, like growing inequality and economic displacement as a result of automation, make populist and national attacks on economic tenets of the liberal international order, most notably free trade, attractive political targets for both parties. If governments can't address the social and political anxieties afflicting the entire West, the liberal component of the order, predicated on open societies and markets, will collapse. Meanwhile, political polarization within the United States is undermining Washington's ability to serve as an effective and predictable strategic actor, not to mention credible guarantor of international order. And finally, domestic fissures create opportunities for intrusions by threats from without, as Russian information operations during the 2016 election cycle and those that are ongoing have vividly demonstrated. So for those three reasons, a defense of the liberal international order is simply not enough. Instead, as I said at the beginning, it is time for a strategic reckoning. We must accept that the next 70 years of international politics will not resemble the last. This means that the existing international order, and indeed our very concepts of international order, must evolve to reflect changed international and domestic conditions. Some elements of the order as it exists today will require modernization, while others may require wholesale abandonment. Renovating the liberal international order and indeed creating a new vision for international order is thus the central challenge for American grand strategy over the coming decade. For despite power diffusion, the US will remain the world's most powerful state with unparalleled capacity to lead. So from the US perspective, we should not simply plan to return to foreign policy business as usual once Trump leaves the White House and a more focused executive from either party takes power. Nor can we revert to old concepts of international order come 2020 or 2024. Instead, international relations thinkers like the ones in this room need to look over the horizon at the world to come and begin to develop a new strategic vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart?
Thanks, Dick. Thank you, panelists. Enjoyed joining you today. I'm assuming everyone in the back can hear me. If you can't, let me know. I'll move the microphone closer. So question, is the liberal order worth defending? And first, my answer, yes. I strongly believe that the liberal world order is worth defending. The alternatives, Hobbesian anarchy or some form of axis of autocracies, are not welcome thoughts. But I also strongly believe the liberal order has been very mismanaged by a combination of ideological hubris and dramatic policy overreaches, particularly since the end of the Cold War. I'm going to try to do three things today. Briefly summarize what many academics and policy professionals view as the stakes in the demise of the liberal order. Then I'll detail how the foundational elements of this world order began eroding, not so coincidentally in my view, just as the expectations of them grew the most, and that would be in the post-Cold War period of the 1990s. And third, a few words on how to save the liberal order from itself. The order faces external challenges from religious totalitarian movements like Al-Qaeda and revisionist autocracies like China and Russia, but the biggest threat to the order comes from within. First, let me offer a vivid summary by the historian Christopher Browning in the current issue of New York Review of Books. This is a very sharp statement, but it encompasses most of the basic assertions about the liberal order and concerns about its demise that we've been hearing ever since Donald Trump was elected. Quoting, "Today, President Trump seems intent on withdrawing the U.S. from the entire post-World War II structure of interlocking diplomatic, military, and economic agreements and organizations that have preserved peace, stability, and prosperity since 1945. His preference for bilateral relations, conceived as zero-sum rivalries in which he is the dominant player and wins, overlaps with the ideological preference of Steve Bannon and the so-called alt-right for the unfettered self-assertion of autonomous xenophobic nation-states. In short, the pre-1914 international system. That, quote, international anarchy produced World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Great Depression, the fascist dictatorships, World War II, and the Holocaust, precisely the sort of disasters that the post-World War II international system has for 7 decades remarkably avoided. Let me just point out that the, quote, international anarchy that existed prior to 1914 also produced periods of relative order and peace, notably the post-Napoleonic concert of Europe through the post-1870 Bismarckian era of balance of power, with much of the 19th century also operating under the liberal hegemony of Great Britain. Yes, that system broke down in 1914, and yes, a radically new order did emerge following World War II. But the key point I want to make is that, quote, international anarchy did not disappear because much of the world accepted a big role for global liberal institutions and a big role for American hegemonic leadership of those institutions in the post-World War II period. Sure, anarchy has been ameliorated, but the underlying structure of the system itself, nation states operating in anarchy, also known as the Westphalian system, has not been replaced. In fact, I believe the biggest mistake many people make in defending the liberal order is presuming that the post-war order and its corresponding institutions represent what the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire would call, quote, the apotheosis of human history, unquote, the highest point of development. That the world is somehow on a clear path toward universal liberal enlightenment and can somehow escape anarchy and glance past the long-standing raw materials of international relations such as nation states and nationalism and assertions of sovereignty. As Steve rightly notes in his War on the Rocks piece, the most ardent supporters of this version of liberal order, quote, proselytize it as the one true path, deviance be damned, unquote. So let me pick it up from there with this general certainty in the macro vision of liberal world order as it's currently structured, with a look at the institutional foundations. I accept the conventional wisdom that 4 big institutions, the United Nations, NATO, the World Trade Organization, and the European Union, represent the bedrock foundation of the post-war liberal order. The UN manages international law, NATO manages international security, the WTO manages international economics, and the EU represents the exemplar of post-sovereignty liberalism, which, by the way, helped win it the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. And let me stipulate that this liberal order played a critical role in ending the Cold War and overseeing the greatest period of shared prosperity in world history. But I also believe that this success contributed to its potential undoing. The big point I want to make is that each of the post-war liberal institutions went too far, too fast, too unrealistically once the Cold War ended. Let's remember how the post-Cold War period began, with the 1-2 punch of George H.W. Bush's New World Order and Francis Fukuyama's so-called end of history, both asserting that Western liberalism had defeated the two great ideological challengers of the 20th century, fascism in the first half, Marxism, Leninism in the second. And it was now time to perfect the liberal project. Voltaire's apotheosis of Enlightenment liberalism was upon us. Indeed, each of the big four institutions underwent major transformations in both size and scope in the 1990s. Steve mentioned two of them, the WTO and EU. He didn't mention the EU, but they didn't even technically come into existence. Actually, you did mention the EU. They didn't even technically come into existence until the 1990s. The WTO was a vastly more expansive and ambitious version of its former GATT that was born of the Bretton Woods system in 1994. And the EU was a vastly more expansive and ambitious version of the 1950s European Economic Community. Same goes for the new expansive roles for NATO, the UN and NATO. What were once foundations of liberal world order became apotheosis institutions bent on the fundamental transformation of world politics. I don't have enough time to go through each of these in detail, and I'm going to caveat also that they are institutions that are well-intentioned and do good in the world, stipulate that. But I want to also offer a bullet point or two on how each of them veered off course over the past quarter century or so. This will help explain how we ended up where we are today, with each of them under duress individually and collectively as a world order. The UN, post-Cold War, for example, transformed its mission from managing relations between sovereign states to supporting humanitarian interventions within them. By 2005, the UN unveiled its new responsibility to protect doctrine, something sovereignty-sensitive countries like Russia and China uneasily accepted until the 2011 Libya war, which quickly turned from a limited intervention to protect civilians into an expansive regime change operation. So when the Syrian humanitarian crisis erupted later that year, Russia and China blocked any UN role at all, out of fear of, quote, a replay of the Libya scenario, unquote. Syria today remains a killing field, Libya is a failed state, and the UN's credibility has yet to recover. NATO also underwent significant changes, shifting from a Cold War military alliance defending Western Europe to a globalized organization involved in out-of-area humanitarian interventions, as in Kosovo in 1999, and the UN-authorized Libya war in 2011. It's also engaged in a dramatic expansion of membership from 16 at the end of the Cold War to 29 today, including several former Soviet republics and satellites. NATO now views itself as an apotheosis liberal institution whose mission was described by former Undersecretary of State Strobe Talbot as, quote, to act as a catalyst for consolidating democracy, establishing the rule of law, and promoting religious tolerance and human rights, unquote. All worthy goals. But is it any wonder why Russia, China, and many other non-Western countries are increasingly distrustful of this institution? Regarding the WTO, I'm not going to critique the goal of expanding liberal capitalism and free trade, which both the GATT and WTO have done. However, specifically as it relates to China, we've seen the ideological underpinnings of the WTO based more on end-of-history certainty than the realities of a rising Asian superpower with traditional geostrategic interests. The big historical bet made upon China accession to the WTO in 2001 was that as long as China remained true to market economics and was integrated in Western institutions, it would inevitably transform into some form of liberal democracy. Over the past 15 years, China's growth has exploded thanks to its integration with the West, but its political system has gone backwards. As Elizabeth Economy put it in her new book, China under Xi Jinping, the potential new emperor for life, is, quote, an illiberal state seeking leadership in a liberal world order, unquote. Obviously, something's got to give there. Ironically, as recent as a few years ago, it was widely assumed by many Western liberals that China would seamlessly replace the United States as leader of the global liberal economic system. Now those same folks are clamoring for renewed American leadership. Finally, I won't spend too much time on the EU. We're all familiar with its troubles in recent years, but I'll point out that what was once an exemplar of post-sovereignty liberalism is now almost a how-not-to guide on centralized decision-making by small groupings of elites, increasingly out of touch with its sometimes rowdy democratic underpinnings. So when the migration crisis struck the continent in the mid-2010s, Europe confronted what the political scientist Ivan Krastev called, quote, its Lehman Brothers moment. The moment we question all past assumptions and try to make sense of a quote unquote new normal. In this case, regarding the issue of borders and sovereignty within Europe. In any event, Europe's end of history goal of becoming, quote, the world's most comfortable retirement home, unquote, as Zbigniew Brzezinski once mockingly called it, is now obviously confronting seismic challenges. To wrap up, by far the best illustration of the acute crisis of the post-Cold War liberal order came in 2016, with the success of populist nationalism in elections held in the world's two most enduring and durable liberal democracies, the UK, where voters chose to leave the European Union, and the US, where Donald Trump won a stunning presidential victory. But make no mistake about it, as my fellow panelists have already mentioned, Brexit and Trump were symptoms, not causes, of the crisis in the liberal world order. A crisis that exposed itself with the poor economic policies that led to the global financial crash in 2008 and the euro crisis beginning in 2009, both of which caused huge recessions, high unemployment, and falling wages for millions of ordinary workers. And a crisis that exposed itself with the perverse situation that has emerged in the West, where liberal elites have become less and less democratic, connecting themselves to ever more aloof institutions, while democratic voters are becoming less liberal, willing to support strongman nationalism as long as it promises to defend their cultural and economic interests. Until the crisis within democracies is resolved, the liberal world order will be in peril, because democracies are the countries that make up that order. That's why repairing the system needs to start from the bottom up. Repairing the system means real reforms, not just rhetoric. It means questioning all underlying assumptions about free trade and immigration and shared burdens of collective defense, not to chip away and unravel the foundations of Western liberalism, but to renew it for the current age. The West invented a political ideology based on innovation and reimagination. Now more than ever, those qualities are needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack.
Liberalism and the liberal order are definitely worth saving. I want to remind you of two really important, very basic facts about that. One is that there has never been a state other than Singapore that has negotiated its way through the middle income trap to high levels of per capita income, sustained economic growth, and political stability without being a full-fledged democracy with full-fledged rule of law, civil rights, and human rights. None. It has never happened. The second fact is the democratic piece. No two mature, stable, true democracies have ever fought wars against each other. I submit that these two facts are two of the most basic important facts that we know about modernity on planet Earth. And they both suggest that we ought to hang on to liberalism and the liberal order if we want to retain these benefits. This is reinforced by the fact that illiberal alternatives that we know from all of history have collapsed from inefficiency, or they have flamed out in an orgy of authoritarian nationalism. China is sometimes portrayed as somehow some miraculous exception to the rule, that somehow its authoritarian technocracy is going to overturn everything that we know about history up to the present date. Maybe so, but we're already seeing warning signs that China is starting to maybe go the way of all those other illiberal alternatives. My colleagues on the panel have said things like we're heading for a reckoning, and we need to steel ourselves for a strategic competition, and that we can't forget that liberalism is just an island in an anarchy of world politics. And I would not necessarily dispute that view of the future, but I do think that as we head for a reckoning, the weapons that we need are mainly liberal ideas and liberal institutions and the power that they bring to any strategic competition. On the other hand, there are internal contradictions in liberalism and the liberal order. One is the contradiction or tension between liberty and equality. The other is the tension between unregulated economic markets and mass democratic participation. These tensions from time to time have created opportunities for populist mobilization. Traditionally, the solution to these problems have been the development of Keynesian regulation of the economy, the creation of democratic welfare state systems to buffer the common citizen from the vagaries and turns of the markets, plus the Bretton Woods type institutions and the follow-ons to those at the international level. So this solution, however, has sometimes created its own problem. That problem is the gap between the people and the elites that are needed to run this Keynesian, Bretton Woods, democratic welfare state system, its institutions not of direct democracy but of representative government, and the role of technocrats in economics and science to tinker with markets, to stabilize them. As Stuart put it, the people running this liberal order have sometimes become aloof from the people that the order is meant to serve. And in this context, there has sometimes been a temptation, both on the left and the right of the political spectrum, to somehow imagine the creation of liberal systems that run only by the invisible hand, both economic markets and free speech, where aloof technocrats or politicians in institutions that are divorced from the people who are investing or are speaking out, that those can be bypassed and democratic systems can somehow run themselves. I submit that this is currently one of the major causes of the liberal crisis. It's a problem of liberal ideology and optimism at best. And it's also a problem of naked material self-interest at its worst. So, to my mind, the way to save the valuable parts of the liberal order requires reinventing the control systems for the economy that we've associated with the welfare state and the liberal international order, and the control systems for our media of speech and information, so that we can reestablish what John Ruggie called the embedded liberal order, and get rid of the fantasy of the indivisible hand of complete and utter freedom of capital, mobility, deregulation of the economy, and a sphere of discourse where anybody can use Facebook to reach millions of people because it's their free right of speech to spread lies and Pizzagate rumors. So to reestablish these kinds of control systems, we can't just copy the welfare state and media systems of the 1950s. Obviously, they're going to have to be adapted to 21st century social and economic and technological realities. Nonetheless, I think that it's important to think about the basic principles by which those old control systems of liberalism worked and try to recreate analogs to them of contemporary systems. The one that I've been thinking about the most has been communications systems and the media. So people wonder what to do about hate speech and incitement on social media. The New York Times had an excellent editorial just 2 or 3 days ago that warned that the problem is not just suppressing individual instances of hate speech and incitement or even fake news, but the point is to think of a system that will regulate media content in a responsible way to create a healthy environment of discourse. To my mind, this means passing legislation, something like the fairness doctrine that says that the media platforms are in fact engaged in journalism, that they have a responsibility to present well thought out information and opinion on important contemporary issues, just like the old fairness doctrine had it for the TV networks before 1988 when the Republicans got rid of it and passed that legislation or something adapted to contemporary times and put journalists in charge of important news feeds on social media. It doesn't mean that you have to prevent free speech on the internet, but it means that you have to give people a nudge by having the modern equivalent of Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley washing over people's consciousness while they're eating dinner. Looking forward to the next stage of our discussion.
Bob.
Well, coming last reminds me of the saying that everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. So let me sort of try to pick both some points I disagree with and some sort of interstices and fill them in. To start with, obviously being a professor, I have to think of what's been written. And there are two very good articles in the recent, or I think current issue of Washington Quarterly. Rebecca co-authored with our former student Mira Rabb-Hopper, one of them that elaborates some of the points she made, and an article by Jim Goldgeier in the same issue on these questions. So I would, and in addition, of course, to Steve's piece in War on the Rocks, that I think is fleshes out some of his provocative comments that really, and reading that, was the impetus for the panel. I agree completely that we can't go back when there's a new administration, we can't go back to January 2017, which I think is sort of most of our impulse of what many of us would like to do, to regard the intervening, let's just 4 or 8, how many ever years as an aberration, a ghost, a Halloween spook that now will go back in the closet and can be ignored. Regardless of the extent to which Trump is a symptom, and I think that's been perhaps a little exaggerated by my colleagues, but it certainly, yeah, even if he is an accident, and to some extent I think he is, in the years he will have been in power, I think, have done irreparable damage to a world order, if there was such a thing, which already had, at minimum, a large number of, if you will, cracks in it. And the one damage I'd stress that has not been mentioned by my colleagues is it returns, although it's implicit in some of the remarks, it returns the world to IR 101, that is, basic points about anarchy. You know, when I teach the introductory course, start off that no country can bind others or can bind itself. And the U.S. had said through NATO and other institutions had made pledges, but those pledges, there's nothing there to enforce them. And when administrations change or conditions change, the pledges can lapse. Steve is absolutely right. We've not walked away from any of our security alliances, but we've chewed them on the ankles, right? It's easy for us to say what you've said, and I think that is an important point, because in some ways Trump's bark may be, although the evening is young yet, to take a line from a Marx Brothers movie, his bark may be worse than his bite, but the bark does matter. And if you were sitting, I think, in Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or even Eastern Poland, or were in South Korea and worried about North Korea and all, I think your perspective would be somewhat different. That is, we have weakened those bonds, and I think what we've shown, I believe, although I have not been to Europe recently and I'm not an expert on this, I think we've taught a lesson to those who thought they could rely on the U.S., which is, no, can't. And this brings up an interesting problem with what Jack mentioned in the democratic piece, that yes, although I think there are problems with the theory, and I lecture on that in some other contexts, that far from democracies being steadfast, it's quite the opposite. It's, I think, the view of democracy that was prevalent in the 19th and early 20th century and in the first 5 or 10 years of the Cold War. I remind you, the academic literature is quite clear on this, that democracy is inimical to a sustained, steady policy. It's quite the opposite. George Kennan was quite eloquent on that, echoing what de Tocqueville had said, and this was conventional wisdom. That may be compatible with the democratic peace, that it's unlikely that democracies would fight each other, but I think the question of the extent to which a democracy is compatible with an order that tries to bind countries, I think it's quite an interesting and unexamined one. I think there are some deep incompatibilities, or at least tensions, there. That leads to the next point, which does agree with my panelists, but we, at least IR scholars, and all of us are, although we look at all of us on the panel, we do look at the rest, that reminds us that foreign policy begins at home and it never stops at the water's edge. I mean, the phrase in certain periods, post-war periods of American history, bipartisanship, foreign policy stops at the water's edge. It was never true. It was often said when it was least true because it was an attempt to convince people they shouldn't do what they were doing. And the whole belief that, the early Cold War years when if not the order, because Stephen is quite right, the order was created in the late 40s is different from the one there, but I think the one we had was built on that. Anyway, the order that was built in those years was very fiercely contested, deep partisan divisions, rhetoric that makes what we hear today seem mild. So foreign policy does begin at home, and I think it is right that that was neglected by many of the academics studying this, and it was neglected by many of the political leaders who were caught unaware of the extent of, if you will, the backlash caused by the failure of the American, and I think to a lesser extent, but not zero, the European systems to cope with or compensate for a growing winner-take-all aspect of the international and national economies, and the failure to cope with the very real tensions produced by immigration. I think it's easy for us in the academy to be scornful and totally unempathetic with people with deep reservations about, if not hostility, toward large-scale immigration. I don't want to speak, I want to be careful about who I'm speaking for, but I think for many of us, immigration provides cheap labor and interesting restaurants, right? We're not, it isn't going to, I have tenure, so even my advanced age is not going to take my job. Indeed, the economic, to the extent that it depresses wages, and the other side, imports of cheap goods, and right, all that's good for me. It increases my buying power. So I think, without endorsing the rhetoric used by opponents of immigration or our president, I think that many of us in the university should be a little careful and before we give wholesale condemnation. Anyway, in any event, it's clear that a neglect of this issue and an inability to deal with it did fundamental damage to the national fabric in a way that affected what is the order. Okay, does the order exist? How many minutes do I have?
2 and 19 seconds.
Whoops. But you took 5 of my seconds. All right, thank you. I think, right, maybe half full. So I think Steve is partly right. I think may go a little too far. As the other panelists said, yes, there are real differences between what we see in post-World War II and even continuing after the end of the Cold War and a lot of other systems. And they did produce, of course, mixed results, but results we should not scorn. It didn't produce world peace, obviously. It did produce or was compatible with peace among the major powers. It did produce unprecedented prosperity, and those can all be lost. It did, I think, encourage democracies abroad, and I think we value that both intrinsically and for the spin-off effects we think it will have for the economic system and for world peace. Furthermore, there was an extent of this order being rules-based. I grant there's a degree of hypocrisy in that, but we shouldn't exaggerate. I think we can see the differences with Trump. To say the order was rules-based meant that the U.S. did restrain its power in certain circumstances, not always. And this is different from what we're seeing with Trump. And I think it brings up the fundamental question, which is where I'll close, of Jack's point about invisible hand both internally and internationally versus a more rules-based. Trump's UN speech is actually quite interesting, and I think does represent his real views. He didn't write it, but at least he did read it, unlike his books, and I think it really is his view. And you can see in several places, he says he echoes what Canning said, the British foreign minister, when his predecessor, this is in Castlereagh, committed suicide. He, in 1815, he said, or 16, said, back to each country for himself and God for us all. That is the antithesis of the liberal world-based order, and you'd better place a lot of faith in God.
Okay, I get the first question, but I'll also entertain a question from the audience before you answer. I noticed that all five of the panelists still managed to brush over fairly quickly what exactly is the international liberal order. And Mike, I have a question about the conceptualization of it. If we think of an order as a set of material causes and effects, as distinct from, say, a rhetorical facade for articulating values, is there really much to this liberal international order other than economic arrangements? Isn't this primarily, if you're talking about things that really affect what happens that would not have happened otherwise, isn't it mostly the economic institutions that we have in mind? In political military area, a real liberal order arguably would have been a transformation of political military relationships into collective security. And the UN was sort of a facade for making a gesture in this direction briefly, but never amounted to anything in that regard. And the actual political military order was really governed by quite traditional alliance arrangements. And that NATO during the Cold War was touted by Western statesmen as a collective security organization, but it wasn't. It was an alliance, a unique and very successful one, but an alliance, and the other arrangements were bilateral. Although one might argue that after the Cold War, NATO transformed from being a military alliance into an ideological club, which would have been movement in the direction of sort of political order, but arguably caused more problems than solutions. So does it matter if I'm right or if I'm wrong? What am I missing? Before any of you answer, since we want to get as much time in as possible for everyone, questions for the audience.
Yes, I'm just wondering, when the liberal order has been described as a rules-based order, what the panelists meant by that. For example, if you view the liberal world order as basically a U.S. hegemony, and the U.S. as the leader of that order gets to decide whether and when it's going to follow those rules, is that a description of a rules-based order? And what do you mean by liberal? If the United States, as the leader of the world order, overthrows democracies, starting with Mossadegh, going to Guatemala, and just going down the line, or what do you mean by order? Does the Vietnamese peasant, who was subject to a genocidal war there by the United States, do you think that person can reasonably view the liberal world order as an order? Would you view it if you were on the ground there in Vietnam or in North Korea, which was leveled by the United States, or in any of the Afghanistan, Iraq, just go down the list since 1945. In what ways is that rules-based? In what way is it liberal? And in what way is it an order?
Okay, anybody on any of these questions?
I'm happy to
I'll
start.
take some.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are several parts. I don't disagree with some of the thrust. Yeah, it was, the liberal order never was based on equality, and that was never, I certainly did not say that, and most of the other panelists didn't say that. Indeed, the standard argument based, especially in the economic area, to Dick's point, is that hegemony is required for order, so-called hegemonic stability theory, developed first by economists, picked up by Steve Krasner and other political scientists, that to have a fairly open economic order requires a country to provide privileged goods for it to overcome the basic collective goods problem. And although that theory has taken many knocks, of course it always does, any theory does, actually holds up fairly well. That I don't think this concept implies, it certainly doesn't imply complete equality. It did imply, and I think there was an element to this, agree to which it was not pure power. That is, a contrast is not to a world in which each country has one vote, but a world in which the hegemon, in this case the US, does consult on many issues, especially within it, not so much related to third world. If we'd had time, I would have talked about that, but I didn't, but does consult with allies and often does listen, not only consults, but actually listens and often does things they want. In a way, ironically, of course, the Libyan intervention was really a response largely to British and French pressure. So yes, there is certainly, it's not equality, but it isn't if you go back and look at other international eras where I think there was much less of a rules-based, certainly in the economic area, to come to Dick's question, there is a significant contrast.
You know, onto the order point, it relates to what Bob was just saying about, was this supposed to just be sort of economic hegemony, or these just economic relationships? And when you think about the beginning of the Cold War and the U.S. leadership of it, it started with containment in Greece and Turkey, and then the Marshall Plan became the economic wing of containment while the U.S. was demobilizing huge numbers of troops, and military spending was getting slashed by the U.S. Congress in 46, 47, 48. So Cordell Hull and Franklin Roosevelt envisioned a post-world order almost entirely economic, with U.S. leadership for the most part and liberal principles. And it wasn't until 1949, with the creation of NATO and the Korean War, that it became militarized. And NATO became kind of the economic wing. I mean, NATO became the military wing of what was supposed to be a mostly economic form of containment, which is the type that Kennan was mostly supporting at the time too, more economic than military. So I agree that would be the definition of the order as the U.S. saw it at the origins of the Cold War, but then things got messy pretty quick.
Yeah, I just want to amplify the question because I think it does respond to what's going on when commentators, especially in the last several years, have been invoking the phrase post-war U.S.-led liberal world order. I heard a lot of sophisticated qualifications of the concept from the panelists, but not a whole lot of affirmative defenses of why must, for analytical or political purposes, why must we invoke this phrase? What does it get us? Since, after all, just a few years ago, we wouldn't have been having a panel called the Liberal World Order. And during its supposed heyday, nobody spoke in these terms. Next to nobody spoke in these terms. They might have talked about world order or international order, not liberal world order, because it was the Cold War and the free world was the operative
And
concept.
Bush's phrase was the New World Order.
New World
Right,
Order.
it did not have liberal or rules-based in it.
So let's be precise about what's going on when we use that question, when we use this phrase. And the question points to, I think, a key area of tension or contradiction in the concept. Is it perfectly compatible to have a rules-based system and U.S. military hegemony? For a lot of American history, that did seem like a contradiction, and those things have been yoked together since about 1940, 1941, and they remain that way since. So it does seem to me that if what you want to do is legitimize U.S. military preeminence in this moment, then it is quite useful to invoke the liberal world order, the U.S.-led liberal world order, because it suggests that there's some overall scheme of rules that is somehow more than the individual parts. If we were to look at NATO, we might say, well, that doesn't look so great. Perhaps it needs revision, and perhaps it's provoked conflict and competition with Russia. And we could go down the list. So that seems to speak to the function of this term. And I don't know that for analytical purposes we have to invoke the liberal world order in order to talk about rules, norms, institutions, and so forth.
Rebecca?
So I think that the liberal international order is useful both as an analytical construct in terms of sort of retrospectively trying to understand the past 70 years plus years of international politics, but also prospectively as we're trying to define sort of what American foreign policy or what American grand strategy should be looking forward. So both as sort of scholars and policymakers, I think that it matters. And the reason for that sort of gets to the relationship between the balance of power, the strategies pursued by the leading states within any given international system, and this concept that we're calling international order. And of course, the balance of power matters a great deal, right? Probably we think it matters the most because it conditions the circumstances in which any state can exercise its power. And in the context of the time horizon we're talking about here, the balance of power is what endowed the United States with a great deal of political, military, economic capabilities with which it was able to go out and shape international politics. But given that vast endowment of material capability, both after World War II and after the end of the Cold War, the U.S. might have done a lot of different things with it. Precisely as several of my co-panelists have just described, there was a vigorous grand strategy debate in the early Cold War, especially prior to the Korean War, in which it wasn't entirely clear what this vast array of power was going to be used for. And the U.S. ultimately settled upon what we've called here the sort of grand strategy of liberal internationalism, which precisely as Bob has been saying, is distinguished at least in part by the fact that it looks for positive sum cooperation opportunities in addition to some exercises of pure coercion. But it's not just an unfettered zero-sum sort of more Trumpian view. This is the contrast that Trump draws for us, right? He shows how different this sort of new vision of America First is from what has always been, a United States first, essentially nationalist grand strategy, but one that also saw opportunities for positive sum cooperation. So the balance of power matters. U.S. grand strategic choices matter. And by the way, that's why we care about domestic political changes within the United States, because it's not at all clear that the American public, and especially a rising generation of millennials who are very skeptical of the exercise, particularly of American military power overseas, are going to continue to support this liberal internationalist grand strategy. But then a third thing matters too, which is sort of the order that emerges from that grand strategy, but that also emerges from patterns of international cooperation among a lot of different states and the interlocking dimensions of many different states' strategies. And here, of course, trade is one example. But I would push back a bit in saying that I don't think that the economic dimension of the international order is entirely divisible from the security dimension, because from the beginning, part of the intent of creating this free trade regime was to attenuate the security dilemma and try to alleviate some of the pressures that had caused the First World War and the Second World War. And moreover, I do think that there are even some dimensions where we should be least likely to see the effects of international order in the security security realm where they are apparent. And there I would point to the non-proliferation regime, where, of course, the exercise of American power has mattered a great deal, but there's been a lot of really interesting research that shows that the sort of international coalitions and multilateral coalitions that have been built around enforcing non-proliferation norms have actually been remarkably successful in keeping the number of nuclear powers quite low.
Jack.
Just quickly, on the definition of liberal order and what are its most important components, I would put in the number one position, far and away, the foreign policy tendencies of well-institutionalized democratic regimes that have material power in the system. And then the rules and institutions for economics and other spheres are a kind of important but second-order aspect of the system. On the question about how this system looks if you're sitting in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, I would distinguish between two zones of world politics. The zone where the liberal order prevails and the zone outside of that, which I would call for shorthand, the zone of anarchy.
Yes.
Yeah, to my mind, when I saw the title of this panel, is the Liberal World Order Worth Preserving, I thought it was inextricably linked to a second question, which comes up in my mind, which is American global primacy, or hegemony, if you wish, worth preserving? And to my surprise, none of the panelists raised that question, much less tried to answer it. So, I mean, to put the question in a sort of crude way, Stephen Walt in his new book suggests that the United States could spend 2.5% of its GDP on the military instead of close to 4%. Do we believe that the world order or the liberal world order would collapse if that happened? I'd be curious to hear what the panelists think.
Yeah, I actually raised the issue of a lot of people thought the world order couldn't sort of sustain itself if the U.S. declined and China, for example, would replace it because they're all going to become westernized. And I think people are not viewing that, at least in the capitals around the world, in the real world of policy, seeing that a little bit different these days. But I also think the U.S. can still sustain leadership. I'm not the biggest fan of Donald Trump, but I agree with Steve that the U.S. hasn't pulled out of much. I mean, it's reorienting itself in a bunch of things. It's going about its business in different ways. But China is in a little bit of trouble right now, while the United States is in a slight amount of economic renaissance, growing at 4%. China's GDP is down to about 6% according to their numbers, which are usually assumed to be slightly inflated. So the idea that China's going to keep growing at 12, 15%, the U.S. is going to be at 2.5%, that might not be the future. And then that means the U.S., and it wasn't just that the U.S., Bob had a New World Order starting with George H.W. Bush. Thomas Paine wrote about a New World Order in 1776. Woodrow Wilson talked about a New World Order in 1919. Cordell Hull and Franklin Roosevelt talked about a New World Order coming out of World War II. The U.S. has always saw itself as potentially leading a world that was based on, at least loosely, I'm not going to, cover over its many mistakes, but a world that has loosely been guided by its own principles of liberal enlightenment. So the U.S., even with Trump, sees it has an interest in playing a role in the world, and as a liberal capitalist power recognizes the importance of an open and liberal international system. So I don't see why the United States should be in some sort of decline or relinquish its role. It doesn't have to be as big as it once was and spending as much as it once did, but it doesn't mean it has to go back to some sort of isolationism, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I wonder, at this time that this was designed, it wasn't meant to be a liberal world order, but rather a moral world order. I mean, I was 5 years old, sitting on the lap of my dad, listening to Eleanor Roosevelt on the radio, talking about human rights. I didn't understand the word, but this was a time that the Europeans were traumatized, 45 million dead, thinking, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? So you got the Geneva Conventions, you got the Human Rights Conventions, you got the Genocide Convention, all meant at creating some kind of a moral order where certain rules of decency would apply, preventing massive slaughter as a main priority. UNESCO, when wars are started in the minds of men, they have to be ended in the minds of men. So I'm coming back to Jack's point that human rights were at the heart of this. not so, at least from the European perspective, rather than economic concerns, and that the security concerns of the European were, let's say, humanistic more than power-driven. So I wonder, going back to when Stephen and Rebecca asked what can be resuscitated, maybe that moral code of our values can be resuscitated. It's echoed now in social development goals of the UN. It's playing out there somewhere. But that might be something to discuss in terms of where are we going from now.
And Jack do, and then I want to add. But Jack's our human rights,
Oh.
our designated
Well,
human rights.
in my view, liberalism is a system that comprises all of the components that I was talking about: democratic control of the state, effectively regulated market economies, civil rights, freedom of speech. It's a package. And from our empirical work on things like economic development and foreign policy behavior, we know that being halfway democratic or halfway reformed in a liberal way doesn't work at all the same way as being a political system that has all of those liberal features. You need them all to get this system to work, including observing human rights at a comparatively high level. So I don't think we could separate out some kind of humanitarian enclave of decency and throw the rest of liberalism overboard. I don't think that will work.
Even the free markets.
Cynthia?
So Jack wants to create a democratic world order, and there's much sentiment to support that, but that's not the world order that we have, as the panelists have tried to describe, although I'm still puzzled what they mean by it. I want to go back to Dick's question and also build on something that Bob Jervis said. I mean, there's been writing, we all know, Bob Cohen's book on after hegemony. So if we think about distinguishing the world order or the order that was created after 1945, where we decided we couldn't roll back communism in Eastern Europe, it would be too risky and too dangerous, so we would consolidate power, security, order, and build liberalism in the West. One can say that was rather successful, and we created a bunch of institutions, particularly the economic ones, but also security order in the context of NATO. Worked differently in Asia. It was not only bilateral, it took longer to democratize, and it wasn't institutionalized. But in Europe, we have this model that then we had a problem with, and this, I think, is the core of Dick's question and where I would differ with the panelists. I think what happened was when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States decided, in part with its allies, to use its newly found unique superpower unipolar status to extend somehow this order globally. And that's the problem, because the countries weren't all democratic. Most of them weren't. Some of them were transitioning, but it wasn't clear where. And the results, I think, have been actually much more successful on the economic side. We successfully integrated Russia and China into Bretton Woods institutions. Sure, China is a state capitalist country that also has private capitalism, and it cheats. We've also cheated a lot too. Just look at US-Japan trade relations. You want good evidence of that. But the rules are still there, and even the Trump administration, Bob Lighthizer, who's been mentioned already, argues that the Trump administration is trying to reform the WTO, not destroy it. I don't know if that's true, but I would hope that it could be modernized. In IMF, it's been a huge success in integrating these countries and the way they've participated. I've written about this too, and so I think the evidence is pretty clear. It's the security side where we have a kind of exceptional effort by people not like Bob Cohen after hegemony, but more like John Eikenberry, who somehow believed we could have a liberal international order and security beyond the UN and turn it into a kind of collective security, turn NATO into a collective security institution, which would have required integrating Russia, and who knows what we would do with China given the problems of a genuine rising power. And I think that's the core of this problematic debate, and it never gets disaggregated that way.
By the way, that Stroh Talbot quote I gave you, the next sentence was a point about welcoming Russia in as long as they,
I know.
yeah.
So my question is this, I mean, couldn't we preserve the parts that have worked and modernize them, principally economic? It wouldn't be exactly what Jack wants, but we don't know where China will be in 25 years. And why not keep rules that mostly work and recognize that the security side was never a liberal world order. It was a European, Western US phenomenon that had its place in time. And what our competitors want is a concert that looks a lot more like the UN. And we may or may not like that, but with a power shift, we may or may not have any choice.
Could I just come in on that? I very much agree, and I think what you've done is to bring us to the 1990s as the core moment, that if there's a historical period that needs some rethinking today, it isn't so much the post-war, post-World War II period, it's the 1990s. And that's why there is, I think, such a sense of disorientation in the American foreign policy community today. It's not because some old lessons that they read about in textbooks are seeming to come under question. It's because their own expectations, forged by lived experiences and decisions from the 1990s, are being dashed today by these assaults by forces that seem to be so thoroughly trounced in the 1990s that their sudden reemergence today, with some modifications, seems stunning. And really, it's on us to get over that and I think revisit, the political dynamics of the 1990s with a much wider view of the terrain, who won and who lost, and question some of the decisions and assumptions forged in the 1990s. And American military primacy, I think, is one of that. And I think I'm quite concerned that the desire to maintain American military primacy as a kind of first order priority could be quite dangerous and not lead to liberal or peaceful outcomes in the world that's emerging, particularly with respect to a rising China. And this is part of my frustration with all the talk about the US-led liberal world order, is that it yokes US military primacy together with rules. There's a case to be made for that, but there's also a case to be made that in fact is a contradiction, and increasingly so as we move forward in history. I should also say that we're having a lot of trouble pinning down what does the liberal world order mean and why exactly do we need to use it. This is a well-informed crowd that probably would vote much the same way if it comes to the next presidential election. So imagine if we're having trouble pinning down what do we mean by the liberal world order and what does it get us as a public political pitch. This discussion, I think, just reinforces my doubts.
And I'd argue in the security sphere, it's important to distinguish the post-World War II security order from the post-Cold War security order. Because in the economic area, people always talked about hegemony as a post-1945 phenomenon. Cohen's book, After Hegemony, was about, but that was about economics. During the Cold War, people analyzing security never talked about American military hegemony. They talked about bipolarity. And so the period of military hegemony and primacy has been a fairly recent and potentially brief interlude.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, so I would agree with this characterization as the 1990s is sort of a key juncture where the sort of teleological optimism takes over, and it goes from just being sort of liberal bloc or the liberal order in contrast to the Soviet-led order or bloc, and really becomes the liberal international order with those ambitions to internationalize. And I think the way we've been talking about NATO is actually instructive here, because NATO actually emerged in the early Cold War period as an answer to the failure of the internationalization of the first attempts at order right after World War II. Initially, there was some ambition to incorporate the Soviet Union within these global order constructs. And as that starts to fail and the Cold War emerges, that there is the birth of NATO. And throughout the Cold War period, NATO is always sort of a means of defending Western and American interests against the failures of the internationalization of order, rather than an attempt to internationalize the order itself. And it's really only in the post-Cold War period, as Stuart was describing, when NATO became or attempted to become a vehicle for broadening the order and potentially internationalizing the order. And so what I think we see when we sort of draw that distinction is that there are, certain ambitions that were tacked on later and could probably also be abandoned, even as some of the core structures may be able to remain intact.
Just one quick bullet point on that, because the New World Order with Bush was about the UN now reinvigorating itself, because the Gulf War brought Russia in for the first time, sort of not vetoing, and that was really that same optimism that maybe these dual institutions can be on the same side of history. Yeah.
Just a couple of things. One, I want to go back a minute on the human rights and of course the question of whether you can have a world order with a large element of defending human rights in a world in which many of the countries don't respect human rights. It's partly related to Stuart's point in the question of did we see an overreach after the Cold War in trying to do things which you really could not do, at least not do without overstretching American power. Yes, I think in terms of primacy and that, certainly what we had was always built on American power. In retrospect, we had military, you can argue we had military primacy as well, but didn't realize it. Could you, and Cohen's very interesting book, After Hegemony, that argued, yes, you could maintain the world, the economic, relatively free trade without American primacy, that it took American primacy or hegemony to establish it, but that it could exist without. That was never tested, because that was written at a point when American economic decline was expected, relative decline with both parts of the Soviet Union, mostly West Europe. That never happened. So that we've never tested how much primacy is needed, which gets back to the provision of public goods and how much you can do of that if you don't have one country that is large enough to give both carrots and sticks. But this comes up specifically, or in a different way, in the relations with China. I mean, that's the fundamental question, and we hope to have a panel later this semester or next semester kicked off by Vice President Pence's speech, but of where Sino-American relations are going, and the fundamental question of what American interest is in the East and South China Sea, and also whether, even if we could define the liberal rules-based order a little more precisely, whether that is incompatible with a degree of Chinese sphere of influence in its backyard, which is exactly what any form of realism would expect one to have. And on this point, just finally, sorry, not contradiction, but odd mixture in Trump, that he's the one who, on the one hand, has said the U.S. should pull back, but on the other hand, of course, has significantly increased the defense budget.
Peter?
I want to pick up on a point that Stuart made about the fact that the biggest threat right now to our, whatever we want to call it, world order, is us. I think that's what he said. It wasn't China, it wasn't Russia, it wasn't Al-Qaeda, it was internal. So my question is, to the extent
Us
that...
being the West broadly.
The West
yeah.
broadly. to the extent that we have an administration and maybe others who believe the way to fix some of the world's current security issues, like, say, Iran, and we start imposing more and more widely based sanctions, Iran, Russia, potentially, depending on where we go with China, are we going to actually push a lot of the other world's countries who need some of those relationships with Iran or Russia to say, you know, why is the U.S. running all of the critical financial institutions of the world? Maybe we need to look at an alternative currency as the global currency, at the Asian Development Bank. Are we in fact creating the very things that are not in our interest?
I mean, just to briefly, I don't see this as very different than other periods in American history, including during the Cold War, when the U.S. was bucking a lot of its allies often, and the question was the U.S. is sort of destroying the world that it created, and it, you know, Steve Sestanovich can speak about this intelligently. You know, the U.S. sometimes takes these leadership roles. The U.S. has more at stake and more responsibility in the Persian Gulf region than the Europeans do, other than economic. So they're going to have a different view of sanctions and relationships with Iran than the United States might when it comes to broader security and its other strategic allies in the region. It's having trouble with several of those allies right now, but it's a different type of relationship than the Europeans have with those countries. So we already kind of addressed this a little bit. The U.S. might have a different role, and sometimes it bucks the very system it created, but the question is, does leadership require that sometimes? And I don't see you're going to see, just because the West operates in the same philosophical sphere, doesn't mean you're not going to see policy differences between the different actors in that order.
If I could answer that question a bit differently, I think that actually one thing that's really interesting looking forward is the extent to which American financial primacy is likely to endure, at least over the next 10 to 15 years. Because while it is logical that policy steps such as the reimposition of Iran sanctions in contravention to the desires of our European allies ought to push even our friends and certainly our adversaries towards alternative currencies, towards alternatives to the U.S. banking system. The fact is that those alternatives just don't really exist. So if you're thinking about alternatives to the dollar as the global reserve currency, neither the euro nor the RMB really has any of the fundamentals that would be required for them to take on that role. If you think about alternatives to the U.S. banking system, similarly, there's just no other country in the world that has the ability, and of course this is related to the currency issue, to serve the function that the American and to a lesser extent the British banking system has served for much of the 20th century and the 21st century. So in the absence of any alternatives, you know, maybe the Europeans will succeed in building this special purpose vehicle to get around Iran sanctions, but more broadly, there just really aren't alternatives. And I think what that tells us is that in this critical domain, and a domain that allows the U.S. to borrow a great deal and therefore advance this military primacy that we've been talking about, I really think we can expect American advantages to endure in a somewhat surprising way.
And I was connecting the two, by the way. I wasn't separating just military power from, obviously there's the underpinning economic power to maintain that larger position.
If anyone in the back has a question, please stick your arm up as high as possible because I can otherwise overlook you. Uncharacteristic reticence. Yes.
So even if we don't necessarily agree on the definition, I think we kind of mainly agree on the causes or the points that have led us to this moment. So I'm wondering if we look towards the future, what should be some of the assumptions that would have to change in the way U.S. engages with the international order, and where do you see some of the most, I guess, pressing issues or important questions to take on in an effort to avoid that violent conflict that reshapes the order and transition in a peaceful way?
I'm happy to take the start.
Jump in.
Okay, well, I think some of them have come up already. And first of all, let me say, I think this is precisely the question that we should be asking. There's been some pushback, I suppose, on the extent of China's rise, but I would be surprised if at the end of the day, anyone on this panel doesn't think that China will at least be a leading power in the international system 15 years from now, and that the system, therefore, must adapt in some ways to its presence. And so, you know, while taking liberalism as a whole, as Jack has suggested, is certainly desirable in many ways, I think one of the major questions is, can we do liberalism in a piecemeal way? Are the economic dimensions separable from the political dimensions, for example? And in particular, are those dimensions separable in a world in which some of the leading states in the international system, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, are likely not to be liberal? Can the system as we know it endure in that case? I think another really important question that we need to be asking has to do with the exercise of American power. Exactly because China is likely to face some important headwinds, and because Russia is a sort of revanchist power in decline, and because the U.S. fundamentals remain quite strong, I think the U.S. is likely to be the most powerful state in the system by most metrics still 10 to 15 years from now. However, the way in which the United States exercises its power will be much less hegemonic because we will have declined in relative terms. And so what will the day-to-day exercise of American power look like in that world of preeminence without hegemony? How must American strategy change to adapt to those circumstances? I think these are the questions that we need to be asking that sort of get to the heart of these assumptions upon which American strategy has rested for quite a long time, but which the trends I identified at the beginning call into question in quite fundamental ways.
So I know you briefly mentioned the technological perspective, and there's been a lot of research and literature about how the technologies like AI, quantum computing could actually favor authoritarianism and could undermine liberalism in general, because like the algorithms and all tend to like is much more centralized, and those who have concentrated amount of power could exploit that, as opposed to all the institutions that we talked about. So do you have any response to that?
I just first generally on the China-U.S. again, a recent book by one of our PhDs, Michael Beckley's book. I forgot the title is, but Cornell University.
Unrivaled.
What? Unrivaled. It's a claim that we've overestimated the degree to which China is likely to close the gap in the U.S. He had an earlier article in International Security, and this is fleshed out in the book. And not saying, there's a lot, I find a lot to it convincing, but I'm not an expert, but those who want to go further should look at that. I think there's just a big question mark on AI and quantum computing and related things, both on how quickly they're going to be here, that I think in many cases we tend to overestimate the pace of some of these technological changes, even if perhaps underestimating their eventual impact. It's a long time. And the way you put it is interesting and poses a fundamental question on innovation, which I think the jury is out of more centralized versus more decentralized systems. And there are obvious advantages for each, and which is stronger we may yet see.
Jack?
So I cut my teeth in political science reading books like The Social History of the Machine Gun before World War I. And you know, all of those books that had the same take-home point, which is that developments in technology are shaped by their social, cultural, and political environment. And so with AI, just like with social media and so forth, I think the main question to ask is, who is to be the master, the machines or the people? And the people have the ability to regulate economic transactions, the development and uses to which technologies are put. My whole point about the social welfare state and embedded liberalism and regulated markets is that if the political system is functioning effectively, any technology that comes along can be put to a use that's compatible with liberal governance of effectively working markets and media environment. And I would steer away from the kind of libertarian myth that the technology will be created and that it will just, break things, and then it'll be somehow good.
Could I just maybe problematize that quickly in two ways? So one is this question of digital authoritarianism, which Jack sort of hinted at before. And the question is whether, given the vast repositories of data to which authoritarian states have access, that will confer some kind of advantages, especially as it relates to artificial intelligence, and perhaps even stabilize authoritarian states, which, as Jack said, have historically been quite unstable. And the second is the extent to which the US can actually harness the technological base that it has for foreign policy ends. And there, of course, we see precisely the social context surrounding antipathy towards cooperation with the federal government in Silicon Valley.
We have time for one more question, and then I'll ask the panelists if they have any parting words on anything at all that they want to leave us with. One more? No more questions? Bob, any further words of wisdom? Mr. Wertheim?
I'll just say one thing, and that is, I think several of the questions make me think that if liberal internationalism and a large role for the United States in the world is to continue, we have to think about whether the US political system will be stable and competent. And that's a question that throughout the period of the so-called liberal international order, I think has largely been taken for granted. And so, even if one accepts all the arguments for American primacy then, what if the kind of governance that we're seeing now, and you might include some leaders before Donald Trump in that, what if that is the way of the future? That really must change our equation in terms of the extent to which the United States can, as Madeleine Albright put it, see farther than others do.
I would just amplify that point by saying one thing that's remarkable about the conversation we've had here today is how much we have been talking about domestic politics within the US and within the West more broadly. And I think if we were having this conversation even in 2015 or 2016 prior to Trump's election, this would have been much more about the international environment rather than the domestic environment. I think that is a salutary change in our conversation, but exactly as Stephen said, I think it's also somewhat of an alarming one as an American who sort of cares about U.S. national interest in particular, because these underlying trends that are calling American leadership into question are really quite fundamental and hard to address. Things like systemic inequality, things like political polarization. So I think it's quite a tall order, because what we've talked about doing here in effect is not only rebuilding the American socio-political and socioeconomic compact in a way that works much better, something that's largely beyond the expertise of us IR scholars, but also then finding a way in the world for the United States and for American strategy to continue advancing American interests. So it's a tall order, but I'm glad that these brilliant minds up here with me are training their sights on it, and hopefully all of you will too.
Quick, and I'm going to agree with much of this, but we need to look at bigger sweeps of history. And people were raising the China-U.S. challenge, next 15 years, how's it going to look? Don't look at today's president. Look at the sweep of Western philosophy versus what might be developing in China, including with use of technology. You have open systems, political systems that fight it out. Obama created some fundamentals that created a strong economy. Trump came in, did some other things that might have boosted the same thing. You don't have the same sort of thing in a country like China, where it's all centrally directed, it's closed, and as much as we fight with politics, when you look back in history, you might see that some of these fights, some of these tangles, some of these elections have consequences, in that you can come out of these things better than before. But that is the history in the last couple of centuries, and I believe looking back in 15, 20 years, we're going to say that it's still the history.
So on U.S. leadership, it's hard for me to say this because I'm a person who's been deeply dismayed by many things about American foreign policy almost for as long as I've been alive. And nonetheless, when I look at which country or set of countries will have the best shot at pulling itself together and exercising some form of like cohesive node around which liberalism reorganizes internationally. It seems to me that the path to that in the US is not certain, but pretty simple. It's the Democrats win 2 elections pretty big in a row, and they do it with a set of policies and concepts that are not polarizing but are inclusive. And
That's the problem.
No, it's both,
least,
Jack. It's not
that's at
either.
least an imaginable.
It's a system.
That's an imaginable fix, I think. When I look at
Yeah.
Europe, however, I think there's a basic question of how to exercise self-determination by the people, and like at what level and who are the people. Is the EU going to be the project? Is it going to be renationalization? How will that sort itself out? It seems to me that there's no kind of short way to do that. And one thing that could help that would be if the US sorts itself out first.
By electing more Democrats.
Yes.
Thank you.
Two Democrats.